Okay, we're going to go ahead right into our committee meetings. First committee meeting is the trustee nomination and board procedures committee, and unfortunately, the chair has two broken arms, and the vice chair has a very serious illness in his family, and neither of them are able to be here. So I'm going to chair this committee. First item on the agenda is to discuss the regulation establishing the powers and duties of the University Boards of Trustees. I would call on our General Counsel, Vicki Shirley, to give us an overview. But before she starts, I want to make it very clear that since this came up 6 months ago or so, there have been numerous collaborative conversations among the various General Counsel. We've had a lot of feedback. There have been a lot of changes, and I think there are very few, if any, issues open. So, Vicki, go right ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair McDevitt. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Yes, as Chair McDevitt mentioned, I have since June had numerous productive conference calls with all of the university general counsels, other university staff, and Board of Governors staff, along with consulting with the chair. It's been a wonderful opportunity to me and a very collaborative experience. There are, however, just a handful, a very few remaining policy issues that the General Counsel could not resolve, and that is for your consideration and discussion today. Because of these policy issues, we are not asking the board to approve this proposed regulation for notice to the public today. This is solely for purposes of discussion. The first policy issue relates to the term of office for the chairs and vice chairs of the trustees, and more specifically, whether an exception permitting a chair or a vice chair to serve a term in excess of the 2 consecutive 2-year terms authorized in the board's initial resolution, where it delegated authority to the boards of trustees in 2003, should be approved by the Board of Governors or by the individual boards of trustees. The prior board resolution, which I just mentioned, is silent on this issue. And in working with the General Counsel on the draft, the issue of an exception came up in light of a request that is next on the agenda for this committee that has come from UWF, asking the board to approve their ability to extend the terms of their chair and their vice chairs past the 2 additional 2-year terms. So I crafted language to provide for an exception for board approval based upon my conversations with UWF and the other counsel.
Okay, Ms. Shirley, let's go to the first item first. I think we've got people here who want to speak to these powers and duties.
Right, and the first policy issue that I'm discussing is whether or not the Board of Governors or the local boards of trustees, which body should be responsible for approving any exception to the ability of a chair or a vice chair to serve an additional term over and above the 2 consecutive terms that our resolution provides. And in working with counsel, one alternative is to have the local boards of trustees approve any exception based upon a 2/3 vote. The reason for the 2/3 vote is to ensure that there is board unity behind this leadership decision. So that's the first policy issue. Do you want me to take this one at a time?
Well, no, but I want to move through this. I believe that there was only one institution that was concerned about this, and that they have found this as an acceptable
That's
solution.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay.
What is the 2/3?
Yes, that we would leave in there the limitation on the 2 2-year terms, but if they wanted to exceed those, they would have to have an extraordinary vote of their local boards.
Thank you. The next policy issue relates to paragraph 5C of the proposed draft, which relates to the requirement for a presidential candidate to appear before the board at the meeting where ratification of that candidate will be considered. A university had a concern about this because it could be perceived as our board second-guessing the selection made by the local board. One university is requesting that prior to ratification, the university provide a written submission of the search criteria, the search process, and the qualifications of the candidate and that the ratification decision be based on that written submission unless there are questions that are raised by the written submission. So that's the second issue for your consideration. The third issue relates to paragraph 7A, and this is the final policy issue. It relates to initial contractual obligations by boards of trustees or direct support organizations to improve real property. More specifically, the issue is whether a board of trustees or a DSO should obtain Board of Governors approval prior to entering into an initial contractual agreement that will result in the trustees or the DSO seeking a commitment of state funds for the development, construction, operation, or maintenance of an educational or research facility. Initially, this paragraph was much broader and applied to all property acquisitions, but in my numerous calls with council, it's clear that that would unduly hinder a university or a DSO's ability to negotiate the purchase of real property. So we have significantly narrowed the scope of that provision so that it only requires board approval if a board of trustees or a DSO is entering into an initial contractual obligation that will obligate them to improve real property and require them to come to us to seek a commitment of state funds for development, construction, operation, and maintenance.
Is it correct that that was an acceptable resolution?
I have not received any policy comments on that in writing. I know that there was one university that had one concern that this...
Could we, instead of always the one university, could we
Well,
go...
you're going to hear it in just a
I mean,
minute. They're here to speak
see
to it.
who is it?
It's
that
the
has
University
issue?
of Florida. They're the only university that has not been satisfied by, at least that we are aware of. But what I was trying to get to is that we may be down to only one issue, is what I thought had happened, but maybe I'm not correct on that.
Well, with the University of Florida, in talking with their general counsel, she certainly understands the property provision. I believe there may still be a concern, and Mr. McGriff may be here to speak to that. On the presidential candidate appearance at the ratification meeting, I believe that's still an outstanding issue with the University of Florida.
Yeah, that was the one that I thought was...
Florida.
Florida.
Yes, sir.
Okay, is that all that...
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Trustee McGriff, would you like to speak to these?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. What order would you like me to take them in?
Anyone you're
Okay,
comfortable doing.
In order of what I think are probably important is the trustee should have responsibility for hiring and firing, for that matter, presidents. And I certainly believe that the trustees should submit to this group, this board, the process and the what have you. But this board does not need to ratify the selection. They need to ratify the process, but not the actual selection. And I think if you're going to ask us as trustees to serve and spend the time, we have to be responsible for hiring and firing the CEO. And I think that's the essence of the issue there. The 2 terms of 2 years and the 2/3 vote, I think that's certainly appropriate and fair, if that's acceptable to y'all. We haven't dealt with that. I can't imagine all the circumstances that we would ever have to deal with that. The real estate issue is a little bit more complex, and once again, it's maybe an imaginary horrible, but if you're entering into it, I think the Board of Governors' responsibility is, if a university enters into a contract that requires this, you have to tell them no. I think that's y'all's responsibility, but you can't limit our ability, the trustees' ability, or the DSO or the university's ability to enter into the contract. You tell them that they don't make the PICO list or whatever the funding issue is. But so I think that trying to deal with a public process with a private landowner, developer, what have you, is very difficult. That's kind of our position on those three issues, Madam Chairman.
Would we like to take this up as a whole document, or do we want to go through them one by one? Governor Duncan?
I have a point of clarification. Do we have the legal ability to not ratify? I thought that was part of our statutory...
No, I think we're required to ratify the selection. It's in the Constitution.
So that's really not...
Yeah, I mean, we've gone through this until I don't know how to solve it anymore. We've tried many approaches to it. But we have the other issue on the, to be honest, Trustee McGriff, I thought that I had an understanding with Chair Morgan on this language, this approach to this, but maybe I'm mistaken.
Well, probably, Madam Chairman, it might be semantics, ratification versus interview.
Oh, no, I'm back on the property.
Oh,
I'm sorry,
okay.
on the property.
All right, I'm sorry. I thought, Member
I'm
Duncan
sorry,
was
I
talking
was
about
just- We do have an obligation to ratify the selection.
yeah, but not require an interview of the person.
We don't care about interviewing him, we
Okay.
just would like him, her,
Yeah.
we would just like them to attend the meeting.
If at all possible, yes, ma'am.
I don't, may I speak?
Sure.
I don't think it says if all possible, does it? Did I miss that?
Well, I mean, it's quite possible that we might have a meeting and the person can't get there, and maybe we could have them talk to us on the phone. I don't think we're trying to make a point that, someone has to go to the ends of the earth to attend a meeting. But I think the idea is that as a president is going to take on the responsibility of one of our state universities, that they should, we should in fact be able to embrace the person at the time that we're ratifying their selection. I mean, I do think it's a very good idea, and we were going to suggest that we include language that says prior to this ratification that you all submit all that information about the process and the qualifications and so on, that was missing, and I think that's an excellent suggestion. But I don't know that we have flexibility about whether we ratify the selection or not. I think that's what we're obligated to do. Yes, sir.
I think this is a silly discussion. I sat for 8 years. We selected a president. It's silly that we're sitting here with the interest of the people of the state of Florida, and there's a question about whether the man selected by a board of trustees doesn't want to come and sit down and meet all of the fine people who are also serving for free. I think it's just silly. Sometimes, we're taking this to the ridiculous. And so, you know what? I saw the beginning part when I could understand the issue, when the chancellor had to interview, the chancellor had to be on the selection committee, and we went through all of that. That's not in here now, right?
That's correct.
We got rid of all of that. But even to suggest that it wouldn't be in the best interest of the people of the state of Florida for a new president to come before the Board of Governors in which he's going to work for the rest of his time, and for the ratification, I think is silly. Now, that's a comment. I don't know why we're spending so much time on it. So I move that we approve that part.
Well, okay, I'm trying to get to, are we going to approve each of these separately, or I think we ought to just approve, take up each of the ones that have an issue, and then we'll have to approve the whole document.
Madam Chair, are we approving the document today? Or
Well, we're recommending, it's the committee would be approving the document.
Okay, I thought it was just going out for notice today, once we were...
Well, yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes, but it's just the committee taking the action.
So, Madam Chair, in light of the fact that we're going to do them individually, and in light of the fact that Governor Tripp moved the approval of that particular issue regarding whether or not the president has to appear at the meeting, I second his motion, and we can deal with that issue.
And could you add to your motion then the requirement that all of this documentation
Yeah.
be
Suggestion, I
submitted
think,
prior
is
to...
really a good one, and I think we ought to work and include that, you know.
Yes, and there's language in your draft that would include that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's, you've accepted that, so you have
Part of the
a,
motion.
we have a motion, is there a second? There's a second, there's a motion and a second, is there any further discussion on that? All right, is there any objection? Hearing none, show that adopted. Now, let's go, can we go to the property one? This, I apologize, Trustee McGriff, I was talking about the property one when I said I thought I had an understanding with Chair Morgan about the approach to this. And so I may have been mistaken.
Well, I think you probably did, and this is just I don't think you're mistaken. I think you actually did have an understanding. The issue's just been raised by some other folks in the process about the public nature of the process versus trying to make a deal, and the responsibility of the Board of Governors to tell a university no. I realize how it puts you in a difficult position, but...
We've had two very serious situations along those lines, just in the short period of time that this board has existed, and that's one of the things we were trying to address here. And I agree that initially this was way too broad, and that all we were getting at really was the situation where you had a commitment of state funds tied to the acquisition of property. And I guess I would have to say to you, from a university perspective, that is pretty poor judgment. If any university would go ahead and acquire under those circumstances if they had not come to the board.
Well,
Yes, well, we have a, wait a second. Go ahead and finish.
Well, excuse me, I was just going to say that I think you're right. A commitment to acquire that requires funding is inappropriate. What we're talking about is we purchase a piece of property that in the development of that property would perhaps require some state funding, but that becomes a totally different conversation.
Oh, that's a whole different thing.
That's-
I
yes.
mean, we're just worried
But-
about taking, at the time of the acquisition, there is a requirement that you utilize the property for a certain type of thing that would require state funding.
I think you're right.
And that was all we were getting at here, Chair Law.
Disconnect here. There have been several versions of this rule, the most recent of which I assume was in the red folder, Vicki. And this is now limited to each Board of Trustees and University Direct Support Organization must obtain prior approval from the Board of Governors before entering into an initial contractual obligation to improve real property. So, am I correct in understanding we are out of the acquisition discussion altogether under this rule?
Yes, originally it was directed to acquisition, and we received a lot of comments about that being burdensome on a university as far as the ability to timely and effectively negotiate a purchase. They felt strongly that it was, it was tied to a development agreement to improve real property or some other contractual obligation to improve real property that would then require a commitment of state funds for development, construction, operation, and maintenance. At that point in time, then the board, it should be taken to the Board of Governors for approval.
Understood. And I think Trustee McGriff, the history of this is such that actually the most troubling circumstances we've encountered have dealt specifically with the issue of acquisition, where transactions have been made, commitments have been made, and then we're in a position of having to deal with an approval process for something where the horse is way out of the barn. However, while that is the troubling thing to me, I completely respect the fact that it is almost impossible to administer at our level in a public process the kind of, the need for confidentiality and privacy that goes on in that process. So I think we have to simply accept that as a risk of, and have confidence in the Board of Trustees. To me, this is watered down to a level that says, if all we're doing is asking you to give us information before you start signing contracts to put, you know, bricks and sticks in the ground, then there certainly isn't a confidentiality issue there that I can see, and frankly, to me, we've taken this as far as we can take it.
I stand corrected. It is watered down much more than I even discussed with Diana Morgan.
So I don't see where else we can go with this and
This
still
should
keep any
not cause
credibility.
anybody any heartburn, because it's bypassed the acquisition process altogether. Chair Law.
I just had one comment. In looking at this new language, my only question is about the word initial. If you have a document, say a letter of intent or something of that sort that has contingencies in it, that one of the contingencies may be the Board of Governors' approval, it seems to me that you wouldn't want to stop it. You might have some economies of scale or something where you want to get somebody kind of taxed down before you actually come to the Board of Governors. And I'm just looking at that one word, wondering if you really intend that, or rather what you're trying to address is making sure that obligations are not being made by the Board of Trustees for funding to come that would ultimately have to be approved by this body.
Maybe we should just take out initial and put binding contractual obligation to
Right.
improve.
That would fix that.
Does that work for you, Governor Pappas?
I'm sorry. I didn't hear the...
Okay, well, maybe if you weren't troubled by it, she was pointing out that the initial, use of the term initial contractual obligation might beg the question if you had a non-binding letter of intent or something like that. So I suggest we take out initial and insert binding okay. All right.
Madam Chairman, what page are you on?
On page 5.
Which,
7A. 7A.
thank you.
It's the first paragraph.
Thank you, I found that. Very good.
I just want to make sure I understand what happens if there is now a binding contractual obligation to come forward. The university enters into the obligation subject to our approval. What happens in the event of subsequent massive change orders or changes in the project?
I knew you were going to say that. Can you offer up a solution to it?
Well, a threshold, a X percent, or a $2 million, or some kind of a threshold. I know we're just putting this out for notice, but, you know, the concern would be that there's a substantial change in the project once the initial obligation is approved. I would think we would at least want to relook at that project if it is a substantial change or a material change to the terms and conditions of the exposure.
I guess what you could do, I'm just thinking out loud here, into a binding contractual obligation that will result in the improvement, because then it would take into account all of that.
Might work. I just get concerned that if the initial obligation is $1 million and a subsequent change order comes in at $10 million, we ought to have the opportunity to at least have notice and review of any substantial material changes. Something, and I know this is just going out, I know we're not approving this today, but I would ask the working group to at least look at that issue, because I don't want deals to change once the initial authorization has been approved.
How about if we just say, a binding contract or any substantial change of that contract? Material change of the contract.
Something of that nature. I mean, I don't want to bicker over what material is, so we may want to put some thresholds in there, but I don't want $1 million approval to become a $20 million obligation, that's all.
10% level?
Okay, can we accept that as the sense and ask Vicki to work on putting the right words in there before it goes out? Can you live with that?
Yes, ma'am, I'm make sure I understand. This is, the contract, the initial contract requires state funding to affect the contract, in other words.
Right,
If
but
if the university purchases a piece of property,
That's
and
out of
2
it.
years later comes back and says, all right, this is our master plan, we want to build a dormitory here, that's a different conversation.
Right.
Okay, yes, ma'am, that's fine. I think that's appropriate.
Yeah, on the other, you'd be on the PICO list or some other list anyway,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, most of this would be covered by that.
Yeah, then it becomes part of the
I agree
strategic
with
plan,
that. I
and,
mean,
yeah,
This is just designed to the odd circumstance, really.
yeah.
All right, can we have a motion to adopt the sense of this language with the instructions for, is there any objection? Any further comment to it? Okay, is there any objection? Hearing none, then show that adopted. And then that brings us, I think, did we go ahead and address the 2 terms?
No,
we're not addressing that issue. All right, can we have a motion and a second to adopt the language that the boards of trustees, chair and vice chair, would not serve more than 2 terms, 2 two-year terms, unless an extraordinary vote of the board allows such an extension? Is there any discussion? Is there any objection? Hearing none, show that adopted. Okay, how about on the entire regulation? This is to move it to notice, or?
No, today is for discussion only. Once I work with the general counsels and come back with the language on the substantial change, and we come up with a threshold, I can bring it back to the board for notice in January.
I thought we were doing that now.
No, ma'am, this has been agended only for discussion.
You mean we're going to have more discussion with the general counsels?
Or I can just draft the
Well, I
substantial
mean,
change language.
it's fine if you want to go back and focus on that language, but I think we've got to close the door on all of this. I mean, on that particular item, yes, let's
Okay,
do
thank you.
that. All right, well then,
Madam
we
Chair?
don't have to take any further action on this.
Madam Chair, could
Yes.
I have one suggestion, since we're talking about it. On page 4, it says, "Each Board of Trustees shall establish policies and procedures for the performance of annual internal audits of university finances and operations. All reports generated from such audits must be submitted to the Board of Governors after review," and I would like to add in there, "and acceptance by the Board of Trustees or its designates." I think our
Yes.
process,
Could you tell us what item number you're on?
that is 6G.
Okay.
I would just like, before we had part of the process, that the local boards of trustees would review and accept
Yeah.
the audits, so that we're not in the middle of that process.
All right, does anybody have any comment on that suggestion? I think it's pretty standard for audit committees to review and accept audit reports.
Question. Our Board of Trustees Audit Committee does that, but the entire board gets a copy but does not act on it.
That's probably technically correct.
However your process is.
Okay, I didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm looking at. I
And it says
I wouldn't
board
like us to be in the middle of the audits out, but they haven't
It's
accepted.
covered because
Yeah, I
that's
see.
taken into account.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, then we'll go ahead. Does anybody have an objection to including that in the draft? Okay. Hearing none, then general counsel will proceed to work on the changes to the language on the property, and hopefully we will put this to rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And on behalf of the University of Florida, I'd like to say we really appreciate all of Vicki's hard work on this.
I would say you should. So thank you. We thank her too. And I think all the general counsels really worked hard on this. So it was a nice collaborative effort, but I hope in the future we can try to truncate some of these things, because this went on and on and on. Okay, the next item on this agenda has to do with the University of West Florida, an extension in the term of the chair and vice chair. If you want to give us a brief explanation.
Yes, thank you, Chair McDevitt. The UWF Board of Trustees are unanimously requesting this board to approve an extension, the ability of that board to extend to their current chair, Casey Clark, and their vice chair, Honor Bell, the ability to serve an additional term after they've already completed their 2 consecutive terms. The reason for this is they are in the midst of a presidential search. You may recall President Kavanaugh left in June, and they would like to have continuity of leadership while they proceed through the search process. They are looking for an extension for each office for 2 years that would take them through December 12th, 2010. Vice Chair Bell is a gubernatorial appointee, and if he is not reappointed by the governor, then his term will end in January of 2010.
Yes, go ahead.
Based on the policy we just theoretically almost approved a few minutes ago, didn't we say if it was a supermajority of their board?
Yeah, but this isn't the policy yet.
So, but based on that general agreement we
They
just
would-
had, this would be an
Automatic
automatic.
do this, yes. Yes, what,
Well, I'd like to just clarify that this exemption may not be necessary pending a discussion by that board in December. So it's a contingency that may not indeed be utilized.
yes, I mean, I think the motion that we'd like to get is to move this extension if the two of them are reelected at the December meeting.
I'd like to move that, please.
All right. Is there any discussion, further discussion? Is there any objection? Hearing none, so adopted. Okay, the next item on this agenda was to take up the committee work plan. We are going to postpone that due to the absence of the chair and the vice chair.